This is Empire Sports Alliance, unfiltered. No fluff, no filters, just the real side of sports. We're talking athletes, coaches, agents, doctors, executives, the people behind the scenes who actually move the needle. From building careers to surviving the grind to winning off the field. This is where real conversations collide.
Welcome back to another edition of Empire Sports Alliance Unfiltered. I'm Ronnie, joined by my co-host Eric. My background is on the wealth management side, and Eric is, a sports chiropractor working with athletes as well as entertainers. Today, we're joined by Eido Walny, the founder of Walny Legal Group LLC. Nationwide recognized asset protection and estate planning attorney. And we're happy to have you here, Eido.
Thanks, Ronnie. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks. I'm excited to hear you talk today because some of the stuff we're going to go over, you don't talk about a lot. And unfortunately, today's topic's going to be based around divorce and athletes and entertainers and some of that ugly backside to it. What goes into it? How can a player be really protected? And I know we're going to dive into that. So I'm going to, Eido, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it right on the head, Eric. Unfortunately, the issues that we're going to talk about today are ones that are ugly and people don't like to talk about them. But because people don't talk about them, they're issues that persist and there's a lot of misinformation. And it's a vicious cycle that unfortunately all too many athletes find themselves trapped in.
I bet. So why is divorce uniquely complicated for the professional athletes and entertainers compared to just someone else who makes a lot of money? What takes it to the next level?
Yeah, I mean, the statistic that I always fall back on is this one, and it's a little bit mind-numbing. Depending on whose numbers you want to believe, the average divorce statistic for first marriages in the U.S. is probably somewhere between, again, 41 to 46, 47% for first-time marriages. So, people often talk about this 50-50 marriage thing. It's actually a little bit lower for most common people on your first marriage. As you tend to get married and divorced and commoditize divorce, that divorce rate tends to go up pretty quickly. But let's call it first marriages somewhere in the mid-40s, low 40s.
But over how long of a time frame are you talking also?
Any first marriage. So anyone's first marriage, the chances of a divorce are somewhere in the mid to low 40s. For a professional athlete, that number is actually in the 70s, around 70%. So the statistical probability of divorce amongst professional athletes is dramatically higher. And then the even crazier statistic is that of those divorces, about half of them are going to come within the first year of that athlete's retirement from sports. And so really you ask about why this is such a difficult issue for people. I don't think any of us need to talk about the kind of lifestyle that professional athletes live, right? It's a short career. The amount of money you're making tends to be very front loaded in terms of your life cycle, right? An average athlete's career is only about 3 to 5 years, maybe 2 to 5 years. Obviously, there are going to be some athletes who play longer, but you tend to have a pretty short professional career. But that divorce statistic for athletes is universal from sport to sport. And really, it says a lot about money, the lifestyle, both while you're playing and then after you're retired. And it's a really, really tough situation for a lot of these athletes because the money you're going to shell out in alimony and child support is really going to make a huge dent in your career earnings. And it's not great for these guys.
So when would you say you should start protecting yourself from a professional athlete perspective, right? A lot of these gals and guys start at a very, very young level. Like when should they start planning really for this kind of stuff to happen, right? And some of it might, maybe marriage is not even in the plans at that point. How should they go about that?
Depending on what you mean by planning, it should happen at an extremely early age, right? So you don't just become a professional athlete out of the blue, right? So there are a lot of people who start to get that trajectory in high school or maybe even a little before high school. And there are people who are going to start gravitating their way, especially with NIL money. But whether it's someone who's trying to be your friend or your boyfriend, girlfriend, your agent, whatever the case may be, right? These satellite people who start to revolve around you start materializing at an earlier and earlier age now. So whether it's getting a system around you of your parents, close advisors, whatever the case may be, my opinion is that it's never too early to start that planning because you really need to start vetting who you're allowing to be in your satellite spheres. And then, of course, once you start earning money, whether it's NIL money in high school, more significant NIL money in college, now with the new NCAA rules, if you're in juniors, if it's hockey, wherever you start to get that real trajectory towards being a professional athlete, you need to start making those relationships with people who are going to help protect you. And I think really that is your agent, it's your financial advisor, your accountant, a lawyer. I can't tell you how many times early on in people's careers I hear the money I'm making isn't enough to justify an attorney. To which my answer is I've seen countless situations with young people signing lifetime endorsement deals for silly low money because no one was advising them. And now they're getting drafted into professional sports and they've got this contract around their neck like an anchor. And so, in my opinion, having some legal advice early on, you don't have to rack up insane legal fees, but to have someone who can advise you and has seen these contracts before is really important. And then, of course, prenuptial agreements, cohabitation agreements. There are any number of agreements you can have that will start to insulate you when it comes time to making sure that the significant other of yours continues to be a positive one and not a negative, adverse financial relationship.
On that particular note, just real quick, you mentioned hockey, right? Obviously, I'm a big Islander fan. So recently, obviously, the last NHL draft, we got Matthew Schaefer, right? I think he just turned 18. Let's just say he's the age of 18.
Yep.
So a gentleman like this, like you saying his planning should have already happened or should be in the midst of the process, or?
Absolutely. So he was playing juniors. I'm sure he's got some people around him. But by the time you get drafted and sign a contract, and certainly, Matthew Schaefer, he's a budding star in the NHL. He's got to have people around him protecting him. And look at Sidney Crosby. That guy was identified as a star as a young teenager. And now he's in his 40s, approaching his 40s. I think he's 39. You don't hear a lot about his private life. He's got a squeaky clean reputation. I don't have any insider information, but man, that guy's network of people who keep his reputation clean and keep him being the Sidney Crosby that we all know is incredibly admirable. And I think whatever that guy's doing, he's not only someone that people should emulate on the ice, but also off the ice.
Does it make, if they're going to sign a prenup or create a prenup, obviously the younger they are, they're not making as much money. They're not as famous. Does that hurt them in any way later down the road? Or
one of the goals of the prenuptial agreement is to spell out what's mine and what's yours. And as you grow, there are a lot of things that go into prenuptial agreements. Generally, it's a good idea for both sides to have an attorney. There's a full financial disclosure generally. And then there are all the terms that go into the prenup. So as you are starting to earn money, you can define what's mine. If the money I'm bringing in my salary then manifests itself in the form of investments or companies or houses, the prenup can spell out that will stay mine. And so regardless of any efforts that my spouse is making to make, say, the marital home better, if I paid for it, it stays mine. And then there isn't questions later that half of the property should be the spouse's, or they put in some sweat equity and some of it should be theirs. All of these things can be worked out in advance. I think the trap for young athletes is to think about it like, I don't have a lot now, and so I don't need this. and then they get into a relationship and now all of a sudden they do have a lot and it's too late, right? Once you get married, the leverage of getting the prenuptial agreement goes away because the threat is we don't get married or we break up altogether. Once you get married, that leverage goes away. You're already married. And now the spouse is going to start to accrue interest in some of your earnings and things you're buying, marital assets. It's never too early. If you're thinking of getting married and you're a professional athlete, I think a prenuptial agreement from a good attorney is an absolute must.
How enforceable are they? Are they ironclad? I don't know if you guys watch the Lincoln Lawyer.
Oh, for sure, yes.
There's a new episode out, and they're trying to find a way around a prenup based on this girl getting an STD in a car, and they're going through the insurance company. It's Hollywood, but
Sure. Nothing in the law is ironclad, right? So I think if you have a well-done agreement, that's better than some schlocky agreement that you found online or that your buddy who, just graduated law school last week is trying to do for you. But like all of these things, there are things that need to be done and they need to be done properly, right? So one of the things I mentioned is both sides should have attorneys. Otherwise, you get into issues that, I didn't understand what I was signing, issues of duress, issues of unfair negotiations because one side was represented by counsel and one wasn't. And then once you actually sign the agreement, it's just like any legal agreement. You can't just pull it out at that point where you're thinking of getting a divorce. You've got to abide by the terms of the actual agreement. As I tell my clients, if you were running a business and you had a supplier, neither of you ever followed the terms of your supply agreement until one of you got mad. And then you pulled the agreement out and said, oh, well, look, you were supposed to be doing this and I was supposed to be doing that. And then if there was a dissolution of our relationship, now you owe me all this money. The other person is, of course, going to say, well, you never followed the terms of the agreement, and so I'm not going to follow the terms of the agreement. Well, the same is true of prenups. You can't just spend all this time and money and effort negotiating the prenup and then filing it away in your sock drawer and then only pulling it out once you think a divorce is imminent. You've got to abide by the terms of that agreement. So if it says you're going to live a certain way, you've got to live that way. If it says you're going to set up separate accounts and pay taxes a certain way, and certain things will be titled a certain way, you've got to actually do that. And if you don't, you risk the document not being enforceable. Are all of these great? No, they're not all great. Some are better than others, but if you have a good lawyer, an experienced lawyer, and the terms are settled well, it's drafted well, and you follow through all of the formalities, you have a much higher likelihood of this being enforceable later than not.
And in regards to the assets, if you're just thinking about it, obviously we're not just talking about bank accounts, cash, right? That's laying around. You're talking maybe intellectual property, right? There's businesses that are owned. How is that stuff that would basically be considered like individually in that agreement? How does that, work, and how's that split up, right?
It depends what the parties negotiate. Some of them, so all of the assets, when you start a prenuptial negotiation, everything's on the table, right? And then it's up to the parties to figure out what they want to be mine or yours or ours. And then also the proceeds of those things, right? So here where I am in Wisconsin, we have marital property laws. And so it's a real trap for the unwary because when people in Wisconsin, right, think of the Packers or the Bucks or the Brewers, when they get paychecks here, the athlete's name is on that paycheck. But in Wisconsin, under marital property laws, again, assuming you don't have a prenup and have elected out of these, that paycheck is equally owned by both spouses. And so even if the spouse's name isn't on that paycheck, she is a 1/2 owner of that money, which also means that anything bought with that money and all of that can be negotiated, but it's got to be done in advance.
How does basically social media, and obviously you have a salary from a team, but what if you retire and then you're representing a shirt company or supplement company? I mean, I'm assuming all that comes in. And what if they were to do stuff together and then they go through a divorce? You see Kelsey and his wife a lot and stuff like that. If they separate, who keeps the name and usage and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, all of that has. So if you have no prenup or even a postnup, which I think is more rare, if you don't have that, then things generally speaking are going to be split 50-50. There is a misunderstanding that I was the breadwinner, I was the athlete, I was earning a lot of salary, it was my endorsements, and the wife was at home, and we're assuming it's the wife, right? There are certainly female professional athletes and men who stay at home, or same-sex couples, but just for our example, let's just assume it's a male athlete and wife is at home. The argument is going to be that her taking care of the kids, her being at home, taking care of the household, managing business affairs, that has value. And just because they didn't receive a paycheck for it, their efforts allowed the professional athlete spouse to really focus on their craft and their trade to earn all that money. So that's why when assets get divided at the point of divorce, it's not going to be 90-10, it's going to be 50-50. And so just thinking I'm the one swinging the bat or I'm the one putting the ball in the hoop and therefore all that's mine, that's wrong way thinking.
So what if okay, you go through a divorce, you represent company A, B, and C. 3 years later, you get a new deal with a different company. Does that spouse still get entitled to take money from it? Or because you're divorced now, any future earnings are purely the athlete?
Yeah, I mean, generally anything after the divorce is not going to come within the confines of a divorce decree or a settlement agreement. So, unless there's some sort of weird thing in the divorce agreement, I mean, let's say that there was some sort of issue where money was wasted or there's some debt owed to the divorcing spouse. Generally speaking, new opportunities post divorce are not going to be subject to any kind of divorce decree. But anything up to that point, including potentially your retirement accounts, which may not have quite vested yet, those are going to be on the table.
Right.
Your pension, because the pension value was accrued during the course of the marriage under this example, even though it may not vest until you're 50 or 55 or 60 under whatever, professional agreement you're in, some of that money in the divorce agreement may actually come years later to the spouse because it accrued over the course of the marriage.
That makes sense.
Can you dive in? I'm just thinking of a most recent example. It's not that recent, but a couple of years ago, Tom Brady, Gisele Bündchen, I think she's actually was worth even more than he was. And, obviously they were both in the spotlight. Just walk us through how something like that comes about when they decide, hey, we're going to part ways, how it goes from step A to the last one.
Pretty crazy, but you're absolutely right. Gisele did earn more than Tom Brady, right? So you think of Tom Brady being this mega celebrity NFL superstar. His wife was making more money than he was. And so, I don't have any inside information on that. I would be absolutely stunned given where they were in their respective careers, her as a model, he as a professional athlete, and with good advisors around him as well. I would be stunned if they didn't have some sort of prenuptial agreement. You didn't hear a lot about that divorce once it happened. And so I have to think that it was all pre-negotiated. I think both of them probably had, because of their public images, a lot of incentive to not let things get ugly in the public eye. And so I think a lot of that was quietly handled, quietly negotiated. Assets were divided, agreements were fulfilled, and then they kind of went their separate ways, and that was that. But I think that's a great example, right? Those are two super high earners, super public figures. It wasn't nasty, at least publicly, settled pretty quickly. Both of them moved on to other relationships and they continue to earn money and go their own ways.
Got it. Maybe just since we're talking about examples, and could the advice ever be from the beginning? Hey, you know what? Because the status, because of you're going to be a star, etc. Let's not get married. I'm thinking specifically. I think an example I think you brought up in one of your previous podcasts was Sidney Crosby, Paul Kariya. Again, going back to the hockey side of things. Can that ever be a solution? Basically, it's just, hey, we're making a business decision that doesn't have anything to do with like an interpersonal relationship, but just it makes more sense that way.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't have inside information on Paul Correa and Sidney Crosby, so I don't know why they haven't gotten married, but I think your example is exactly right. Both of those two players were stars. Sidney's still a star, and they were with their respective significant others for very, very long periods, probably 2 decades now for both of them respectively, but neither has gotten married. So why haven't they gotten married? We can speculate. I think there is a reasonable probability they're making the most amount of money during their playing career, although Paul Correa is obviously retired now and has been for a while. And maybe they just like the way that their relationships are, where they can walk away at some point. But I think for someone like Sidney Crosby and Connor McDavid, who I think is engaged now but isn't married, they're making a lot of money over the course of their career. If they were to get divorced after being married during their playing days, they stand to be on the hook for alimony payments far in excess of what they're probably going to be making post-career. And so maybe the thought is, listen, let me focus on being an athlete now, make the money I'm going to make. And then once I'm retired, maybe then we get married, because the financial calculuses are different. Sidney Crosby, no doubt, is going to be involved in business ventures once he retires, but he's not going to be a player. Whether he makes as much or more money post-career remains to be seen. I mean, obviously, he's a pretty special person, but I think there's a lot of reasons people might do that. But there are also a lot of options available to them, right? As a single person, he can set up trusts. He can set up business entities. Kobe Bryant was really good at these sorts of things. You can set up quite an empire for yourself. And when you're not accountable to a spouse, you have a lot more flexibility to kind of do what you want.
I want to talk about a couple of other things here a little bit later in terms of asset protection, taxation in general. And I think the difference between the states and how important that is. But I think overall, this is a very important topic to discuss. That being said, how often has it happened, Eido, that people are stepping into your office and like, Eido, I got a problem, I need your help, where they actually come into your office on their own?
It has certainly happened a number of times. I mean, normally someone is recommending something. What I like to try to avoid, and this is unfortunately, this happens as well, right? Something has already happened. There's a lawsuit pending, there's a divorce imminent, and that's when they start to seek help. Generally speaking, by that point, it can be and often is too late for advanced asset protection planning. Once you have a known creditor, or someone who is already sort of manifested, you're not going to be able to plan around that creditor, because those are fraudulent transfers that can rise to criminality. And so you want to do the planning when you've got clean hands, right? You don't want to have a known creditor or someone who's about to be a known creditor already out there, because then it'll be effective as to everybody. But yeah, I mean, we've had people come in with absolutely clean hands. I know this is an issue. I've seen people before me run into problems, and I just want to avoid that. But we've certainly seen people recommended in either by team management or their agent, or a fellow player that we've worked with, or unfortunately, sometimes a problem has already come up.
How are judges? Are they any different when it comes to a high-earning, high-profile case, or they're pretty good at keeping it even across the board?
They're people, right? And so I think judges, even though they get to wear the black robes and sit on a platform higher than everybody else, they're still people. And so I think that, especially in situations where you've got a very high earner and someone who is less of a high earner because they're the spouse, it's hard to not have sympathy for that person. And then once you see people start to do maybe uncouth things, right? So this is not just true for professional athletes, but I think people in general, once you try to start moving assets around, once you see the relationship start to sour, now you're doing things that you maybe didn't do before. Judges will tend to come down on those people and punish them for doing that because they don't like to see it. And when you're someone who's got a system around you, or your agent, or you're starting to get bad advice like that, I think there is a propensity for the judge to start to financially punish you. And so There's a lot of things that can be done to manage that. That's where good advisors around you are going to help you. But that's why coming for help early and getting that advice really it's invaluable, because once you start to make these mistakes, it is hard to undo them and it starts to look bad. And those optics certainly can be consequential, because again, these judges are people and they see people acting in a certain way or doing certain things, and they don't like that behavior. The one thing they can do is financially punish you, and you certainly don't want that.
So what's the one advice to someone who's listening? What should they check tomorrow to make sure they already did A, B, C, and D? What do they need ASAP?
Talk to a good estate planning / asset protection attorney. You've probably got decent financial help around you. Everybody wants to make money. Generally speaking, the first advisor that a lot of these people sign with is the financial advisor. I mean, Rodney can probably speak to that even better than I, because everyone wants to take their earnings and multiply them, right? Make X times 1.3, 1.5, 1.7. And then you've got your accountant, right? Because generally you've got to file taxes. It's not a good look to wind up owing the IRS even more money than you need to. But then they tend not to maybe have as much legal help around them. And so get a good estate planning attorney as part of your overall financial service advisory team, right? There are opportunities, some really amazing opportunities, depending on what league you're in, to leverage the contract that you've got in a way that also leverages your financial security, your asset protection standing, at least get some basic planning in. Another sort of crazy statistic is that only of the general U.S. population, only about 40% of the population has any kind of estate plan, right? Normal people. And of those 40%, only 40% of those are current as to that person's current standing, right? Meaning they haven't been divorced, no significant change in the law that's affected their planning. Well, if you do that math, that's only 16% of the U.S. population, general population, that has an estate plan. Amongst professional athletes, right? People who think they're bulletproof, career's going to last forever, every marriage is going to last forever. The numbers are even lower, because these guys are focused on the day-to-day grind of being an athlete and trying to stay in their respective leagues. A lot of them really don't want to think about estate planning, wills, trusts, right? Don't bother me with that. But what they don't understand is that this isn't about death planning. What this is about making sure that you've got a solid financial standing so that your accountant, your financial advisor, your banker, your insurance agent, they have a solid foundation from which to build, that we don't have to then start to deconstruct and then reconstruct later. So if you've got these plans in place, there's a lot of good that everybody can accrue from that. And you can at least start to have these conversations about asset protection planning. Some of this stuff can get kind of heady and complicated. And so if you can plant that seed and start to think about things, during the off season or when you've got some free time, it's really important. And so I would say just start to have these conversations. Again, never too early. As long as you're 18 is when you can start to sign documents. Can't stress how important it is. It can be a real difference maker if a situation arises. And it's not sexy investments in certain vehicles and restaurants and the cool stuff that Ronnie does. But it's so fundamental and foundational, so important, so overlooked. If I was going to give one bit of advice, Eric, that would absolutely be it. Just have those conversations.
So you see differences? Sorry, go ahead.
For you, I would say, when you meet with a client and let's say it's a rookie, do you say, hey, automatically you're going to take X% out and it's going to go towards this person, this person, this person, and this person? These are automatic musts you have to do before we move forward. Or do they fight you on it a lot?
Well,
So-
it really
Go ahead,
depends,
Rodney.
right, on the circumstances, right? Go ahead.
I was going to say the exact same thing, right? So for me, there's no such thing as a cookie cutter solution for anyone. Everyone's situation is different. And especially professional athletes, their maturity level, their ability to focus on certain things or understand certain concepts, their family background, where they are situationally, all has to be taken into account. And then and this isn't just me, I think any good attorney would approach it the same way. We're very collaborative, right? Nothing is done in a vacuum. The quote unquote right solution is going to come not only with the conversation with the client, but also with the client's financial advisor, banker, insurance agent, all the various people that make up that person's financial services team. And then together, we're going to figure out a game plan, right? What needs to get put in place initially? What are we going to start feathering in? If X happens, how are we going to address that? And then again, the different leagues might offer different opportunities as well. I know that, for example, in the NBA, it's not uncommon for certain of those contracts to include life insurance. And sometimes that life insurance can be assigned to a trust and is convertible. The team's interest in that is to make sure that the contract has insurance to back it. And so generally they'll want a relatively inexpensive option. So you'll get term or convertible term. Well, if it's convertible term, that's great because then we can put that into a trust. It can be converted into whole life later. We don't have to convert all of it. You're going to have all these options. But if you simply think of it as, well, the contract allows this insurance, I'll take the insurance, it'll be in my estate. There could be some really negative implications to that, and you've missed a real opportunity. And so talking with your financial services team, we can identify those opportunities, walk you through it. There's going to be a window of opportunity that's going to close after a certain deadline, but you wouldn't even know you had the opportunity if you weren't talking to your financial services team.
So you see a big difference in terms of the different sports. When I say big difference, there's differences between the different leagues, the different sports that you're dealing with.
For sure. And not only based on the kinds of contracts that they sign and some of the different incentives, different money. The NBA, you're talking about stratospheric dollars, even for younger players, simply by nature of the fact that there are less people on a team and revenues are really good. And then you look at hockey, right? Those starting salaries tend to be much more modest. Baseball tends to be much more modest. Revenues are strong, but they're spread over a lot more people. And there's really sophisticated minor league teams that the major league teams are helping to sponsor and operate. And so you're talking about different situations. And then you level on top of that and strictly generalizing, certain sports are bringing in people with different financial backgrounds. Hockey is a very expensive sport to get into. And so a lot of those players came from middle class, upper class families. Why? Because, hockey's expensive. Ice time's expensive, especially in the US and certainly now in Canada. And so those players tend to have some experience with dealing with financial advisors and bankers and attorneys simply because their parents did. And again, strictly generalizing, that tends to be less common in some of the other sports. And so you've got to account for the player's appetite for dealing with this. I'm not a lawyer, and not just me again, who wants to overwhelm you with options, sell you on things you don't understand. From my perspective, if the player doesn't understand the things we're talking about, no matter how much you charge them or what fancy things you sell them, if they don't get it, it's a bad option because they're not going to be able to live by the terms. Again, they've got a very complicated and busy lifestyle. I am very, to me, it's requisite that they really understand and appreciate what it is that we're doing. And if they don't understand, that's not a good option for them. Let's find something else that does work and that they can appreciate.
If from an asset protection perspective, we could just elaborate a little bit in terms of, you just mentioned basketball, you mentioned hockey, very international sports, right?
Yep.
People coming from overseas, but even again, baseball, same thing. So, and even for a mostly like domestic league, like the NFL, for instance, right? The individual states with their individual laws. If depending again, where you live, where you're from, where you're actually making your money, etc. From not necessarily just yet from a taxation perspective, but from an asset protection perspective, what is there to consider? I guess not just for international folks, but also, for domestic. Again, the different states have different laws when it comes to that, right? So
yeah. So I mean, I think for international players, the trap is to think, I'm from the Czech Republic, I'm from France, I'm from wherever, Sweden. And so I don't have to worry about any of this stuff. And that couldn't be further from the truth, right? When you're in the US and you're subject to the laws here, you're playing here, you're earning money here, you're paying taxes here, potentially. You could get sued here. And so I think for athletes who are in the US, they need to be aware of these options available to them, right? Because they're subject to US laws. And so it's smart to have someone back in your home country helping advise you on that side of things. But while you're earning money here and have assets here, have a home here, potentially are meeting a spouse here, you've got to be aware of the laws here and make sure that you're doing good planning. And then, if again, a lot of them, even after they retire, end up moving here and spending the rest of their lives here. That's not uncommon. And so, as we talked about before, never too early to start with that stuff. And if you leave, you can always wind down some of that stuff. And so you're protecting yourself while you're playing and while you're here, and then let it go away once you move back or move somewhere else. In terms of the different jurisdictions, absolutely. Every state has different laws. The cool thing about asset protection planning is oftentimes there are things that we can do with the player to hook them into jurisdictions other than the one that they're living in for asset protection purposes. So you can set up a trust in a place like Nevada or South Dakota, Alaska, Delaware. There are a lot of really great states with asset protection laws that are favorable. And so you don't have to live there. You may need to move assets there, or maybe as simple as hiring a trustee there. But if that's the trade-off for good asset protection from the kind of person who, frankly, is simply subject to creditors more than an average person, I look at that as a cheap insurance premium payment, right? If you've got to pay an annual fee to a trustee in a different jurisdiction, what's the difference between that and, your homeowner's insurance or your auto insurance? At least with the asset protection planning, there's a higher probability that you'll need that than, your home burning down or you getting into a car accident. So absolutely, jurisdiction shopping is part of the job.
What do you flip it? So I have a patient who's lives here, and he's actually going to go play in Mexico because he's older and he's not getting picked up. So for someone like him in baseball, if you're going to go play in Mexico, the DR, wherever, or even how about the NFL when they go play in England and Brazil and so forth, how are they paying? Are they only doing federal taxes because it does it go to the state, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there are taxation treaties between all these different countries. And so depending on, Mexico and Canada and Europe, they've got tax treaties with the US. And so that's how that would all be governed. I would absolutely defer to the who deal with this on a day-to-day basis rather than myself. But again, you're of the patient who's playing in Mexico, that person is going to be spending a significant amount of time in Mexico. They'll still have assets in the US. So it's that those US based assets are protected, but they would absolutely be foolish to assume that because they've got, powers of attorney in Arizona, that all of a sudden those will be respected in Mexico. So the script is flipped for them as well. It would be really important to talk to someone domestically in Mexico or the UK or wherever they happen to be spending a lot of time, and make sure that they're getting good advice for during the season where they're going to be spending a bunch of time in these different countries, because you can't assume that your US documents are going to save you if something comes up. In fact, the opposite is probably true. And that's where people like me have a lot of really great relationships with other people in those because, in the UK in particular, I've got really good contacts from footballers who are the UK, but now spending a bunch of time here, and vice versa. Thankfully, we're starting to see a lot of US soccer players go in Europe. And I don't practice in the UK, and I don't practice in France and Portugal. And so I've got to have counterparts in those countries, and likewise they do here in the US, so that we can have a financial services team that can help these clients regardless of where they are.
Nice. I need someone in Mexico.
I'll keep that in mind. We could talk after the show.
All right.
Could I just, from a taxation perspective, let's, maybe talk about that. As I mentioned, all my pro teams that I'm rooting for in the wonderful state of New York, from again, living in California, New York, they're all very high, taxation states. So, if I look at going back to hockey, but even baseball, if I look to, the Florida Panthers, for instance, right, if you look at some of the players they were able to sign or re-sign that wasn't expected in terms of the impact of having no state income tax, what do you see there in terms of, advantage for these clubs, basically to get players that they normally couldn't because it's just a more attractive way for them to stay there?
Yeah, I mean, listen, you get taxed in the state where you're performing. And so, if you're in, let's say, the NFL, although now there's an odd number of games, let's go back to the good old days when there was, 16 games. Generally, you've got 8 home games and 8 away games. And assuming you're in a state with multiple teams like, California or New York, you'll be playing your games in one state and then your away games in other states. And you'll owe taxes to those states where you play your away games. That's why professional athletes have incredibly complicated tax filings.
Yeah.
But for teams, in leagues with a lot of games, baseball, basketball, hockey, you're talking about a significant home jurisdictions with no state income tax. I think this is partially why the Athletics are in a state like Nevada, where there's, they're moving from California, perhaps the highest taxing a state for professional athletes, to Nevada, where there's essentially no state income tax for these people. I think that's absolutely a competitive advantage. The commissioners try to that it's a small deal. There's so few spots that not many athletes have the luxury of making those sorts of tax motivated decisions. And I think there's something to that, right? There aren't a ton of professional athletes, and not everyone is a Sidney Crosby or a Shohei Ohtani who can write their own ticket and go where they want. A lot of times guys are signing with a or maybe two where they have options, and maybe they're both in California, or one's in California, one's in New York, right? You're not going to have the issue of picking the lower taxing jurisdiction. But as you start to develop the star power to make some decisions, you've got one team in a very high tax jurisdiction and one team in a no tax jurisdiction. You're talking about potentially tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars difference in taxation. I can't imagine that's something that the financial services team isn't at least having a conversation about. Now, maybe there are ways of making some of that money back through endorsements or, depending on the different markets. But man, if you've got everything else equal and you've got one state taxing you a lot and one state taxing you zero, I can't imagine that play into the conversation. Again, if you have the luxury of making a decision like that.
I mean, you probably saw, I think the discussion was, once again, a Jets drafted quarterback won the Super Bowl here, that, plays in Washington, state of Washington, and, plays what, probably because he has 2 division games a year with Sam Darnold, right? Now they're going preparing for the Super Bowl in California. So he has a total of 12 days now. He's being taxed with that job tax, right? Is that something to consider? I'm talking from an individual that actually decides, I'm like, hey, I need to consider that, because if I have a $30 million contract, that's going to have a real impact. I mean, this is real money we're talking about. So,
I mean, I'm not an accountant, but, you don't have a ton of guys making $30 million, $20 million a year, right? You're talking a pretty small sub-segment of even professional athletes. So a lot of guys are making significantly less than that, are hanging on to just be a professional and don't have the luxury of making that kind of decision. But there are guys who have that option and do have the luxury of choosing between different teams, and a number of teams may be coming after them. And so here again, I mean, you're thinking about situations where that decision for team A versus team B can be the difference in tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in tax a year.
So from an employer perspective, and now let's talk quickly about the Dodgers then. In terms of the way some of these contracts have been structured lately. I know, Eric, it's a soft spot for you, but you're smiling. So an Ohtani in terms of and obviously with Tucker, the newest one, is that a reason why that's happening this way? Is that the player is that a team of, again, people that are planning that, having these discussions, or how does it come about?
So, Ohtani, I think, was a really situation. His contract structure, I think, was, as far as I know, really the first to set things up the way he did. And I'll be honest, when I heard of his contract, my first thought was that there's no way that works. he's getting, and for those who don't know, I mean, he got a dramatically backloaded contract. I mean, he's basically a minimal amount of money during his prime playing days. And then at the point where he's essentially going to be retired or at the very end of his career, the amount of money he starts earning jumps dramatically. And the thought process is at that point, he won't be tied to the state of California. He can go to a taxing jurisdiction or even back to Japan. The taxation would be dramatically different. So because of that, my assumption was, you can't assign income. And the IRS doesn't like when you play kinds of games where you're really making the money now, but getting paid later. They want their money now. California wants their money now. But as the taxing authorities got into it, I mean, at some point, there was a decision made that, yes, that works, and we're going to allow that. I think the big beneficiary of that, obviously, is the because it gives them a lot of financial flexibility. It's Ohtani. He's going to save a ton of money in taxes because, I mean, I can promise you he's not hanging around California once those big dollars start to kick in. There's just no way. No matter how big of a celebrity he is, he's not going to be able to that kind of tax money. And so I think based on that, that has certainly baseball players knew to structure contracts like that. I do think it might be something that they're going to look into because, again, aside from being able to afford more star players all at once, put it under a budget, you start to be able to pay some now and some people later, this kind of deferred money. It helps manage budgets. And even a team like the Dodgers that's to print money and afford guys like Eric, it's something that's going to give them flexibility. And I think it's a new option that's on the table.
So what are the poor Yankees going to do then? My team.
Crazy that it wasn't the Yankees who came up with this sort of thing, right? I mean, the Yankees are a team that traditionally has been on the forefront of spending and being creative and collecting talent. And yet they were second fiddle to the Dodgers. But I guess that's why they were at home when the Dodgers were winning the World Series.
Oh, is that so? That's a type of conversation for later, maybe.
Cubs fan, right? So I you can cry me a river about all
Nobody's
that.
perfect, Eido. We know that.
That's right. 2016 was 10 years ago now, but at least was in my lifetime. I get to say I saw the Cubs win a World Series in my lifetime.
I can say that for baseball and in hockey. Some of the other sports, we're still working on it, but we're diligently doing our work. So
that's right.
Yeah, like the Jets, right?
The mighty Jets, yes.
The Maple Leafs, how many, diehard fans, Toronto, the mecca of hockey, haven't seen the Maple Leafs even sniff a Stanley Cup in close to 60 years.
I mean, that just recently saw for a long time ever, like they saw them win a playoff series, right?
That's right.
Which is another question. Again, in Canada, I think, and I'm not an expert, obviously, on the taxation side of things, but it's not a cheap country to live in, right?
No.
Obviously, great city, great hockey background. If you look at Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, even Ottawa and stuff, the Oilers. Is that a decision for somebody to make in terms of like something to consider? Hey, I want to play for a storied franchise like they have up there, but it's just, just going to be too expensive.
I mean, again, not many players have the luxury of making decisions like that, right? If the team wants to decide when you've got this option or no other option or maybe one other option, you've got to make decisions based on that. In the NHL, for example, all contracts to try to even up that disparity, they're all paid US dollars, right? So if you're if you're a Canadian team or you're a player who's playing in Canada, right, not playing with a slightly devalued Canadian dollar. So the league's to make that even, but no doubt, a place like Toronto is as expensive as a place like LA, New York. It's a very expensive place. But, if you're happy to be a professional athlete and this is the team you happen to be at, it's just the cost of being an athlete. Being an athlete is a hard thing. It's a hard lifestyle, right? Those of us who have had the good fortune of working with these guys, you as a fan, you put them on a pedestal and you think, man, that's the greatest life ever. But those of us who have seen the other side of it know just how hard it is, right? It's a really hard lifestyle. And in a place like Toronto, I mean, we've seen it in hockey, it's a lot of heat, right? It's like playing baseball in New York. The heat is very hot. And some guys aren't cut out for that. It can be very difficult.
So in terms of like just kind of like overall, I think this has been great. So, what I heard from you, doesn't matter the age, playing early, playing often. It seems like it's not just about the finances, but also kind of like your legacy, because again, I always would make the argument, these ladies, these gentlemen, they have to make very tough decisions. They have to plan for a lot of stuff at a very young age with very little life experience, maybe experience in terms of their particular field or their sport. But, for them, for us, again, if we screw up, we don't plan, or something goes sideways, like we can make adjustments when their playing career is over. That, maybe in the mid 30s, or even earlier, right? So depending on the sport, like any kind of last, comments or like suggestions, hey, like if you took away one thing, again, if you're a coach, if you're an executive, if you're a scout, if you're a young athlete, what would it be, Eido, excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, getting a complete financial services team, not financial advisor, in your orbit is really important, right? You don't know what you don't know. Estate planning, asset protection is a highly unknown, misunderstood area. It's an area you're just going to be able to hop on the old Google machine and figure out for yourself. You're not going to be able to find good trusts online for the sorts of things we're talking about. You get someone in your team, have that be someone you touch bases with every so often. Don't be that person who works so hard and is so focused on making the most of your athletic career only to, give up half of it because you lost it in a divorce or somebody sued you, right? I mean, we just saw Gavin McKenna in Penn State take a swing at some guy and then get arrested, and felony charges were filed, right? So that's all sorting itself out. But don't be that person who is taking unnecessary risks with your earning and well-being. The three of us have sort of linear careers, right? The older we get, we're going to make a lot more money over time. Athletes aren't like that. You've got a very short career. Your earning potential is very condensed. And then generally speaking, you're going to make a lot less the rest of your life. You want to have a good financial services team with you. Not only the financial advisor who's going to help you with investments, not only the accountant and the banker who are going to make sure that you've got good loans and are paying your taxes. You want to make sure you have that good estate planner and that good insurance agent who's going to mitigate risk for you, put good protections in place, and make sure whether it's a divorce, someone suing you, a car accident, creditors come in a number of different forms, and you want to make sure that you've got structures in place so that you mitigate your risk and maximize your long-term viability for success. Lose the money that you've made, make the most of it. And that's where people like all of us come in and try to help.
Yeah, I think that's all.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a lot, and hopefully we have you back on. But yeah, that was it for this episode. And again, I appreciate you guys' time and you coming on, Eido. And thank you very much for all the advice.
Absolutely. Thanks, fellas. It was nicer to see you in person when we were together, but always nice to see you on the old Zoom machine.
We will do that again. So, thank you.
Thank you.